Dean told me on a Tuesday, standing at the foot of the bed with a coffee mug in his hand and his car keys already hooked around one finger, like the whole thing was a memo he'd been asked to deliver on his way out the door. 12 of them, he said. Saturday. 2 weeks. You'll want to get the guest room sorted before then. I was 5 days out from a lumbar fusion. There was a brace strapped around my middle that made me look like a woman wearing a piece of scaffolding under her nightshirt. There was still a bruise on the back of my hand where the IV had blown, purple going yellow at the edges. I had a printed sheet in the nightstand drawer with my surgeon's restrictions on it in bold letters, and one of those letters spelled out that I was not to lift anything heavier than a gallon of milk for 6 weeks. I laughed. It came out of me before I could think about it, this small, startled sound, because I assumed he was being funny in that dry way he sometimes was, the way he'd been back when he was still trying. Then I looked at his face and my laugh died somewhere around my throat. He wasn't kidding. He was checking the time. "Dean," I said. My voice stayed level. It always stays level. That's the thing about me that everybody in that family mistook for agreement for the better part of 2 decades. I had surgery, my spine, on Thursday. You'll be fine by Saturday. That's not how a fusion works. He finally looked at me then, and what I saw in his eyes was not cruelty. I want to be precise about this, because cruelty would have been easier to explain to people later. It was something flatter than cruelty. It was the look you give a chair that's slightly in your way. "It's already arranged," he said. "Mom's booked the time off. Trey's got the truck. It's happening." And then he left. I heard the garage door go up, and the engine, and the garage door come down, and then the house was so quiet I could hear the ice maker working 2 rooms away. Trey's got the truck. I lay there in the dark of a Tuesday morning with the blinds half open, and I turned that sentence over and over the way your tongue keeps going back to a chipped tooth. Why would a man driving 6 hours for a summer visit need a truck? My name is Claire. The house Dean announced he was filling with 12 people was a 2-story on Marrow Hill Road with a crooked oak in the front yard and a porch my father rebuilt himself the summer I turned 9, because a contractor quoted him a number he found personally offensive. I know which board creaks. I know that the 3rd step has a nail my dad drove at an angle and swore about for 20 minutes. I grew up in that house. My mother died in the back bedroom in the spring of 2011 with her hand in mine, and my father followed her 4 years later, and when the paperwork was finally done, the house came to me. Not to us. To me. My dad had been very particular about that, in the quiet way he was particular about most things. He'd set the property into a family trust years before he got sick. I was the trustee. I was the beneficiary. Dean's name appeared nowhere in that document, and at the time I remember feeling almost embarrassed about it, like my father had left a small insult sitting on the table between us. I brought it up once. Dean was watching a game. He said, "That's your dad being your dad," and reached for the remote, and that was the last conversation we ever had about it. Then we moved in, and something happened to the grammar. It stopped being my house. It became the house, then our house. And by the time Dean's mother started referring to the back bedroom as my room in front of guests, it had quietly become the family house, and I had become the woman who lived in it and kept it running. Every July they came. All of them. Marlene and Wendell, married 46 years, both of them with the specific confidence of people who've never once had to consider that they might be a lot. Dean's brother Trey, his wife Kimber, their 3 kids, Dean's sister Paige, her husband, their toddler, cousins who attached themselves to the group like barnacles some years and not others, so the number floated between 10 and 13, and I learned to just cook for 14 and call it math. 2 weeks, every summer, for 19 years. I bought the groceries. Marlene had gone gluten-free at some point around 2016, not for a medical reason, but because a woman at her church had, and so every list I made had a second list stapled to the back of it. Wendell wouldn't eat anything with visible onion. Trey's middle kid was in a phase, and the phase changed annually, and nobody ever told me what the new phase was until I'd already bought a cart full of the old one. I made the beds. I hauled the air mattress up from the basement and the second one down from the attic and the third one out of Paige's trunk because hers had a slow leak and mine did not. I ran the washer at 11 at night so there'd be towels in the morning. I drove to the airport at 6 a.m. twice a summer. I stood in 100 photographs slightly out of frame, or not in them at all, because somebody has to hold the camera, and I was always the one already standing. 19 summers. And in 19 summers, nobody in that family ever once asked me if the dates worked. Why would they? It had always worked. Water finds the low spot and sits in it, and nobody thanks the low spot. That Tuesday night, I couldn't sleep. Some of that was the back. There's a particular kind of ache that comes after they cut through muscle to get at bone, and it doesn't throb so much as announce itself in slow waves, like something breathing under the floorboards. But most of it was the truck. I shook a pill out of the bottle and looked at it for a while and put it back. I wanted my head clear. At about 1 a.m, I got up. It took me almost 2 minutes to get from lying down to standing, which is a thing nobody tells you about spinal surgery, that you will spend your first weeks negotiating with gravity like it's a creditor. I went down the hall in my socks, past the door of the room my daughter Emmy grew up in, and into the kitchen, and I sat down at the island with the old family iPad. The iPad was the one everybody used and nobody owned. It lived in a drawer with the takeout menus. Emmy had set it up years ago and had never bothered to separate the accounts, so it pulled messages from Dean's number and mine both, and had for so long that neither of us thought about it anymore. I wasn't snooping. I want that on the record, though I've since decided I don't actually owe anyone that particular reassurance. I opened it to look up the surgeon's aftercare portal, and a message thread was sitting right there at the top, and the preview line said, "Deposits back, so we're good on the truck either way," and I stopped moving. The thread was called Marrow Hill. They'd named a group chat after my street. I read it from the beginning. It took me 1 hour and 11 minutes, and my back seized twice, and I read it anyway. It had started in March. Trey and Kimber had lost their rental. The landlord was selling. There was a lot of complaining about that, and I skimmed it, because Trey had been complaining about landlords since the Bush administration, and it never went anywhere. Then, in April, Dean wrote, "Talked it through. You guys take the downstairs. Long term. We'll figure the rest out as we go." And Marlene wrote back, "Finally. That house has been sitting there half empty for years. Half empty. My daughter's bedroom, my mother's room, the office where my father did the crossword in ink because he thought pencil was cowardly. Half empty." Kimber asked what I thought about it. That's the part I keep coming back to, because Kimber was the only one who asked, and she asked in April, and she asked in a way that made it obvious she already suspected the answer. Dean wrote, "Don't worry about Claire. She'll be fine once it's happening. She always is. She always is." Paige asked about the surgery in June. Dean said it was routine. He said I'd be up and around in a week. Somebody sent a thumbs up. The conversation moved on to whether Wendell's recliner would fit in the U-Haul or should just be bought new. Wendell's recliner. They weren't visiting. There was no 2 weeks. 2 weeks was the number Dean had picked to tell me, because 2 weeks was a number my body might survive and a number my mouth had never once said no to. The truck was for furniture. The furniture was for the downstairs. And once 12 people and a recliner and 3 kids' worth of bunk beds were physically inside my father's house, the conversation about whether they should be there would be over, because that's how it always works. Possession isn't 9/10 of the law. It's 10/10 of the argument. I sat in my own kitchen at 2 a.m. in a plastic brace, and I understood, with a clarity I hadn't had about anything in years, that my husband had scheduled the takeover of my house for the exact window in which I would be too broken to stand in the doorway. That wasn't an accident of timing. He'd had since March. He picked July. I didn't cry. I've thought about that a lot since, whether something was wrong with me that night, and I've decided nothing was. Crying is what you do when a thing hurts and you don't know what to do about it. I knew what to do about it. I just needed the numbers first. I logged into the joint account. Now, I want to explain something about our finances because people always want to know how a woman doesn't notice. I noticed. I just filed it. Dean handled the checking. I handled the house and the insurance and Emmy's tuition and the trust paperwork and everything my father had left behind, and Dean handled the checking, and for years that arrangement worked fine because Dean was not a reckless man. He was a careful man. It turns out careful and honest are different words. I pulled the statements back 4 years and sorted them by recipient. The transfers to Trey started in 2022. $600 here, $1,100 there, a $4,000 one in November of that year with the memo line MESC, which is the memo line a man uses when he assumes nobody's reading. They got bigger and more regular, and by 2024, they had a rhythm to them, the first of the month, like rent, except flowing the wrong direction. I added it up at 4 a.m. with a legal pad and my father's mechanical pencil, and the number at the bottom was $63,420. $63,000 of our money, my money that came out of the same account that paid for Emmy's meal plan and the new water heater in the roof, sent to a man who had told me at Thanksgiving that he didn't believe in handouts. And here's the part that took the air out of me. In 2023, I asked Dean if we could do the kitchen. Not a gut job. Cabinets and a countertop, because the counter had a burn mark my mother made in 1998 and the drawer fronts had started to come off in your hand. I got a quote. $19,000. Dean said we didn't have it. He said it kindly. He said it the way you'd explain weather to a child. He said maybe in a couple of years, and I said okay, and I went and bought a length of contact paper for $11 and covered the burn mark myself, and I never asked again, because I'm the kind of woman who only asks once. That same year, according to the statements in front of me, he'd sent his brother $22,000. I sat at the island until the window over the sink went from black to gray to a sort of dirty gold, and somewhere in there, I stopped being sad about my marriage. I'm not going to pretend that's a nice thing to say. It isn't. But it's what happened. Something in me simply set the thing down. The way you set down a box you've been carrying so long, you forgot your arms could feel like anything else. I called Naomi Reyes at 9 that morning. Naomi had handled my father's estate. She was one of those lawyers who lets you finish, who doesn't do the thing where they start nodding before you're done to show you they've already got it. I told her everything. The surgery, the announcement, the truck, the group chat, the $63,000. When I got to the end, there was a pause, and then she said, "Claire, I want to ask you one question, and I want you to answer it fast, without thinking. Do you want to stop this, or do you want to survive it?" I said, "Stop it." She said, "Good, because those are different plans and the second one is worse." Here's what she told me, and I'm going to lay it out plainly because I know exactly who's listening to this right now, and some of you need it more than you need the rest of my story. The house is in the trust. I am the trustee. Dean is not a beneficiary, not a co-trustee, not on the deed, and living somewhere for 19 years does not convert a guest into an owner. He has a marital interest to argue about someday in a divorce, and that argument is a lot weaker than he thinks it is when the asset came in as an inheritance and was never commingled. But none of that gives him the authority to move 12 other adults and children into a property he does not hold title to. He can't invite them, Naomi said. He can want to. He cannot do it. The trustee decides occupancy. You're the trustee. I said, "He has a key." Then change the locks. I said, "Can I do that?" And she said the sentence I have thought about probably 400 times since. "Claire, you keep asking me for permission to do things you already have the right to do. That's not a legal problem, but it's the whole problem." I had 3 days. Wednesday, a locksmith named Reuben came out and rekeyed the house. Every exterior door, plus the door from the garage into the mudroom, which is the door Dean actually uses and which I knew he'd try first. Reuben took 90 minutes and charged me $240 and never asked why a woman in a back brace was standing in her own foyer at 10 in the morning, watching him work like it was a religious service. I gave him a bottle of water and he told me about his daughter's softball team. It was the nicest conversation I'd had in a month. Wednesday afternoon, Naomi's office drafted 2 documents. The first was a letter to Dean. It stated that the property was held in trust, identified me as sole trustee, and revoked any implied authority he had to grant access, occupancy, or storage rights to any third party. It was 3 paragraphs. It was the politest thing I've ever read that could take a man's life apart. The second was a set of 12 notices, 1 per person, name printed on each. They were short. They said that the property was private, that no occupancy had been authorized, and that any attempt to enter or to place belongings inside would be treated as trespass. Naomi's name was on the bottom with her bar number and her phone number, which she said mattered more than anything else in the document because people will argue with a woman and go quiet at a phone number. Thursday, I called the sheriff's office and asked about a civil standby. That's a real thing, and I didn't know it was a real thing until Naomi said it. You call, you explain that a dispute is likely and that you'd like a deputy present to keep it from becoming something else, and if they have someone free, they come and stand there. They don't take sides, they just exist, and the existing does most of the work. Thursday afternoon, I called my insurance and got the home health nurse moved from twice a week to daily for the first stretch. Her name was Dolores. She was 61, built like a fire hydrant, and had been doing post-surgical home care for 26 years. And Friday, I called Emmy. That was the only part I was afraid of. She's 20. She's at nursing school 4 hours north. She's her grandfather's granddaughter down to the bones, which is to say she does not have a diplomatic year. I told her all of it. I told it badly. I kept saying, I don't want to put you in the middle, and she let me say it twice, and then she said, Mom, stop. And then she said, he booked a truck. Yes. For after your surgery. Yes. There was a silence on the line about 4 seconds long, and when she spoke again, her voice had gone somewhere I'd never heard it go, low and very calm. I'm coming home Saturday, she said. Don't argue with me. I've got the car, and I've got no clinicals until Tuesday, and I'm coming home. I said, Emmy, you don't have to. And she said, I know I don't have to. Nobody in this family ever has to. That's kind of the whole thing, isn't it? I got off the phone, and I sat down on the third step, the one with my dad's crooked nail, and that's where I finally cried. Not for the marriage, for the fact that it had taken me until my daughter was grown for somebody in my house to say I'm coming without being asked first. Dean noticed nothing. That's the detail people never believe, and it's the truest part of this whole story. He came home Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. He ate. He watched his shows. He asked me once, on Thursday, whether I'd gotten the beds sorted, and I said the guest rooms were being handled, which was true in a way he wasn't equipped to hear. He didn't notice that his key hadn't worked because he came in through the garage, and I'd left the garage on the old code until Friday night on purpose. He didn't notice that I'd moved my father's papers and my mother's rings and the trust binder into a safe deposit box at the credit union because he'd have had to notice they existed first. He didn't notice that I hadn't bought a single grocery. 19 summers of watching me prepare, and he could not tell the difference between a woman preparing and a woman who had stopped. Friday night, he stood in the kitchen doorway with his phone in his hand and said, They'll be here around 10. I said, okay. And he looked at me for a second, and I watched something almost surface in him, some flicker of an instinct that a thing was wrong, and then I watched him decide not to look at it. He said, Thanks, Claire, and went to bed. That's the last thing my husband ever said to me while he still believed he was going to win. They came at 10:14 on Saturday morning. I know the time because Dolores was there taking my vitals at the kitchen table, and she looked up at the clock when the first horn went. 2 SUVs and a pickup, and behind them, moving slow and wide and taking out a low branch of my father's oak on the way in, a 26-foot U-Haul. I stood at the front window with a coffee I wasn't drinking, and I watched them spill out onto my lawn, 12 of them. Marlene in her travel cardigan, Wendell already walking around the side of the house toward the shade like a man taking inventory. Trey swinging down out of the truck cab in a way that told you he'd been enjoying driving it. Kimber, who got out and stood by the passenger door with her arms crossed and didn't move, and who I noticed and who I have thought about since. Kids everywhere, the toddler on Paige's hip, somebody's dog, and Dean coming out onto the porch with his arms open like the mayor of somewhere. Taped to the front door at eye level, where the storm door frame holds a page flat, was one sheet of paper in a plastic sleeve. Private property, no occupancy authorized, held in trust. Trustee, C. Halloway. Inquiries, Reyes and Ott, 55524088817. And parked at the curb across the street, engine off, window down, elbow out, a Clay County deputy named Officer Pruitt, who had shown up at 9:50 and accepted a coffee and said, Ma'am, I'm not here to do anything. I'm here so nobody else does anything. Dean read the sign. I watched him read it 4 times. I could see his lips move on the 3rd pass. Then he tried the door, Then he took out his keys and tried the door again, and did that thing men do where they jiggle a key harder as though the lock is being stubborn rather than correct. Then he turned around and looked at the deputy's cruiser, and the whole thing on his face came apart at once. The rest, I heard through glass and through the storm door, which I did not open. Marlene got to the porch first. She's a small woman with a big engine. She started with reason, which is the most dangerous thing about her, that she always opens with reason. Claire, honey, open the door. We've driven 6 hours. The children need the bathroom. Then she moved to volume. Claire Holloway, you open this door right now. Then she moved to the thing she actually meant, which is where Marlene always lands, and lands fast. This is our family's home. And I opened the storm door about 8 inches, and I said, no, Marlene, it's my father's. I hadn't planned to say that. It just came out of me, already assembled, like it had been sitting somewhere in my chest since 2011, waiting for the door to open. I handed her an envelope. Her name was on it. I handed one to Wendell, one to Trey, one to Kimber, one to Paige. I did it slowly, because slowly was the only speed I had, and because slow turns out to be its own kind of force. Nobody grabs a piece of paper out of the hand of a woman in a spinal brace who is moving like she's underwater. They just take it. Then they read it. Trey got to the word trespass and looked up and said, "Are you kidding me right now?" And I said, "Trey, how much money has Dean sent you since 2022? The lawn went very quiet. He said, "That's not," and stopped. I said, $63,420. I have the statements. Does Kimber know that number? And Kimber from beside the truck said, "No." Just that. One word, from 30 feet away, in a voice like a dropped plate. Marlene said, "This is between family." And I said, "Marlene, I've made your breakfast for 19 years. I'm the only person on this lawn who's ever been staff." Dean grabbed my arm. Not hard. I want to be exact because I've been asked. He grabbed my arm above the elbow the way you'd steer someone, and he said, low, right into my ear so nobody else would hear, "Do not do this in front of my mother." And a car door shut behind me. Emmy had pulled in at some point during all of it, parked crooked on the grass, and she came up those porch steps past all of them, and she took her father's hand off my arm, one finger at a time, and she said, "She just had spine surgery. Get off her." Officer Pruitt had gotten out of his car. He hadn't come up the walk. He was just standing by his fender with his thumbs in his belt, looking mildly at the middle distance, and that was enough. Dean let go. They didn't leave right away. Nobody ever leaves right away. There was about 40 minutes of it on the lawn. Wendell tried the back door and found it locked and came around front looking like a man who'd been personally insulted by a doorknob. Paige cried, which I felt bad about, and still do, a little. The dog got into the flower bed. Marlene made 3 separate phone calls to people I've never met, narrating the situation in a voice pitched to Carrie. The U-Haul had to be unloaded eventually, somewhere, and it turned out that a 26-footer full of a family's entire life is a genuinely hard problem when the plan for it was Claire will be fine once it's happening. They ended up at a Days Inn out by the interstate, and then at a storage unit on Route 9 that Trey rented month to month, and then at Paige's, where 12 people did not fit, and then eventually 3 weeks later, at a rental in the next county that cost $400 more a month than the one they'd lost. I know that because Dean told me, in the tone of a man presenting me with a bill. But the part I remember from that Saturday isn't the noise. It's that at some point, Kimber walked over to the storm door, just her. She stood on the other side of the screen, and she didn't say sorry, and I didn't need her to. She said, "I asked him, in April, I asked him what you thought." I said, "I know. I read it." She nodded slowly, and she looked past me, into my house, at the hallway with the crooked step and the water stain on the ceiling I'd been meaning to fix for 2 years. She said, "He told us you already knew." And there it was. The whole architecture of 19 years, in 6 words. He told them I knew. Every one of those people had driven 6 hours believing they'd been invited by both of us, because Dean had spent 2 decades handing out my hospitality with his own name on the card. That's not a man who forgot to ask. That's a man who worked out early that the asking was optional and then built a life on it. And then, when my body finally failed at the exact moment his brother needed a bedroom, saw an opportunity instead of a wife, I said, "Kimber, I'm sorry, I really am. This wasn't aimed at you." And she said, "I know." And she went back to the truck and she got in the passenger side and shut the door, and she didn't get out again. Dean did not get better. I know that's not the ending people want. I know how these stories are supposed to go. He's supposed to sit at the kitchen table with a mug going cold in his hands and say, "I didn't know it added up to that much," and I'm supposed to forgive him slowly over an autumn, and there's supposed to be a scene where he defends me to his father on the phone, and I stand in the doorway with a dish towel and feel something settle in my chest. That's not what happened. What happened is that he came back that night and told me I had humiliated him. Not that he'd hurt me. Not that he'd lied. That I had humiliated him, on his own lawn, in front of his mother, and that whatever point I thought I'd made it in the most vindictive way available to me. I said, "Dean, you moved a truck of furniture toward my house while I was on a fentanyl drip." And he said, "It's not your house, Claire. My God, listen to yourself." 19 years, and there it was, said out loud in my father's kitchen at 9:40 at night. Not a slip, a belief. He'd been carrying it around the whole time, fully formed, and I'd just never given him a reason to set it on the table. He slept in the den. On the 4th day, he tried a new approach, which was tenderness, and it was worse than the shouting, because I could see the machinery of it. He brought me a heating pad. He asked about my pain scale. He waited until I'd said a 4, and then said, in the softest voice, that Trey's kids were sleeping on a floor, and did I really want that on me? On the 9th day, he called Naomi's office himself, which she found genuinely funny, and asked whether marital property meant what he thought it meant. She told him he was welcome to retain counsel, and that she'd be delighted to hear from them. Nobody ever called. On the 16th day, I asked him one question. I'd been saving it. I asked it at the kitchen island, with the contact paper over my mother's burn mark peeling up at one corner between us. I said, "In 2023, I asked you for a kitchen. $19,000. You told me we didn't have it. That same year you sent your brother 22. I don't want an apology. I want to know what you were thinking when you said no to me." And Dean looked at that peeling contact paper for a long moment, and then he said, "You'd have been fine either way." That's it. That's the whole answer. That's 19 years. I filed on a Thursday in August. Here's what I've learned in the years since, and I'd like to hand it to you the way Naomi handed it to me, because I don't think it belongs to me anymore. The trust held. It held completely. It turns out that when a house comes to you as an inheritance and you never put another person's name on it and you never run it through a joint account, the law is remarkably clear about whose it is, and the only person who was ever confused about it was the man sleeping in it. The proceedings took 11 months. He asked for the house. He didn't get the house. He asked for half the value of the house. He didn't get that either. What he got was half of a checking account that had already been quietly emptied by $63,000 of his brother's rent, and I let him have all of it, every last dollar of what was left, because I would have paid 10 times that to be done. Marlene called twice in the fall. The first time she left a voicemail about forgiveness, and about how a family is a living thing, and about how I would regret this when I was older. The second time she left one that was mostly just my name, said 3 times, in a tone she probably thought was maternal. I didn't call back. Not out of spite. I just didn't have anything to say to her, and I've stopped manufacturing things to say to people out of politeness. That was the actual skill I lost that summer, and I don't want it back. Wendell never called at all. Trey and Kimber separated in the spring. I heard it secondhand. I felt nothing about it that I'd want repeated, except for one thing. I hope Kimber's all right. She was the only one who asked. Dean is in an apartment on the east side of town. Emmy sees him sometimes. She tells me when she does, and she doesn't editorialize, and I've never once asked her to pick, because a woman who spent 19 years being handed out by her husband is not going to turn around and start handing out her daughter. He's told people, I'm given to understand, that his ex-wife locked his family out of their own home while they stood in the driveway. And every time it gets back to me, I notice the same thing about the sentence, which is that it's true. Every word of it is true. He just leaves out the surgery and the truck and the group chat named after my street and the $63,000 and the fact that his mother stood on a porch my father built with his hands and called it our family's home to the face of the only person on the property who'd ever been born in it. I did the kitchen in March. It cost $21,000 by then, because everything does. There's a countertop where the burn mark used to be, and I'll admit I stood there for a second before they took the old one out, with my hand flat on that scorched laminate, saying goodbye to my mother's worst afternoon in 1998. And then I let it go, and it was fine. I want to say one more thing, and then I'll let you go. I keep getting asked what the moment was. People want the moment. They want the line in the sand, the sign on the door, the deputy at the curb, the daughter on the porch taking her father's hand off my arm. But it wasn't any of that. Those were consequences. Consequences are easy. Consequences just happen once you've done the hard thing. The hard thing was at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday, in a brace, at my own kitchen island, when I read a sentence my husband had written about me in March, and did not immediately start looking for the way it might not mean what it meant. Don't worry about Claire. She'll be fine once it's happening. She always is. He wasn't lying. That's what got me. He was describing me accurately. He'd watched me for 19 years, and he'd taken good notes. And everything he'd built, the truck and the timing and the 2-week story and the recliner, all of it rested on one load-bearing assumption about the woman he'd married, that I would be fine, because I always was. I stopped being fine that night, and the entire structure came down within a week. It turns out it was never a marriage. It was a system. And I was the part of it that never complained, and there is no version of a system like that which survives the quiet part, deciding to speak. If you're listening to this in a house you keep running for people who've never asked whether you're tired, I'm not going to tell you to change your locks. Your situation is your own, and I don't know it. I'll just tell you the thing Naomi told me, and I'll tell it to you the same way, without softening it, because softening it is what got me 19 years in the first place. You keep asking permission to do things you already have the right to do. That's not a legal problem, that's the whole problem. If this story found you tonight in a kitchen you're standing in alone, I'd like to know where you're listening from. Leave your city in the comments. I read them, all of them, and some nights they're the reason I keep telling these. If you've ever been the one who is always fine, subscribe. There's a new story here every day, and one of them is going to sound exactly like yours. I'll see you in the next one.